The MiG-21's radar operator stared at his screen in disbelief. Moments earlier, a pair of MiG fighters had acquired their target, a small American jet, flying low over the Nevada desert. They were running a simulation red flag, the legendary U.S. Air Force combat training exercise. Soviet advisors, embedded through proxy allies, had long considered these drills inflated American bravado. But this time, something felt different. The American jet on their screen didn't behave like anything they'd encountered before. It darted sideways, climbing into a high G loop that defied expectations and Soviet flight dynamics. The MiG-21s tried to track it, but within seconds, the contact disappeared. Not because it was cloaked or jammed, because it was now behind them. Within less than 30 seconds of visual acquisition, both MiGs were dead, killed in a simulated dogfight by what Soviet analysts had previously called a lightweight, underpowered gimmick. That jet was the F-16 Fighting Falcon. In the debriefing room, the tension was suffocating. Soviet-trained pilots reviewed the HUD footage frame by frame. The Falcon had pulled over 9 Gs in a tight turn, reversed its axis, and fired 2 simulated missiles before the MiGs had even begun their countermaneuvers. The result wasn't just a loss. It was an embarrassment, one that would send shockwaves through Soviet aviation circles for years to come. This wasn't a fluke. It was the beginning of a pattern. A single-engine jet, developed on a shoestring budget and mocked by some U.S. officials as too simple, was dominating dogfights across the globe. And it was doing so by doing one thing no Soviet fighter could turn tighter, faster, and with total control. Soviet MiG command had long believed in speed, climb rate, and brute force thrust. They thought air combat was about who could shoot first and run fastest. The F-16 didn't play by those rules. It changed the geometry of aerial warfare, defying everything the Soviets thought they knew about dogfights. This is the story of how the F-16 turned inside every Soviet plan, beat every Soviet theory, and forced MiG designers to admit a terrifying truth: agility was now destiny. In 1975, deep inside a concrete-walled analysis center near Zhukovsky Airfield, Soviet aviation officers gathered around a long table. Spread out before them were technical drawings, radar plots, and early photographs of America's newest jet fighter, the F-16. To them, it was a puzzle, wrapped in a contradiction. It had a single engine, already a mark against it, in the eyes of MiG engineers who favored twin-engine redundancy. It lacked heavy armor, and it didn't carry long-range radar missiles. On paper, it seemed weak, fragile. A stripped-down platform unlikely to survive in real combat. The Soviets were used to judging strength by mass, the MiG-25 Foxbat. Their pride could outrun nearly any jet in the world. The MiG-23 had variable sweep wings for high-speed intercepts. Soviet design philosophy favored vertical climb, raw thrust, and high-speed zooms. The idea was simple: hit fast, hit first, and disengage before Western fighters could react. But the F-16 was none of those things, and that's exactly what made it dangerous. What the Soviet analysts failed to grasp was that this new fighter wasn't designed to dominate by brute force. It was built to turn. It featured something unprecedented: a fly-by-wire control system that electronically interpreted pilot input and adjusted control surfaces in real time. In simpler terms, it let the pilot push the jet beyond traditional aerodynamic limits without losing control. Soviet fighters, by contrast, relied on mechanical stick-and-rudder controls that physically could not match the F-16's precision at high Gs. Still, Soviet brass dismissed it. They believed American combat doctrine was too reliant on electronics, too vulnerable to jamming, too fragile under real-world conditions. They were wrong. In test after test, F-16s outmaneuvered legacy aircraft with ease. NATO pilots reported simulated dogfights where they could reverse position, lock a tone, and kill a MiG-style adversary before their opponent completed a turn. But the decisive wake-up call came during joint exercises, where international pilots flying F-16s routinely bested more powerful fighters. It wasn't just the aircraft, it was the way it enabled the pilot to dominate the engagement envelope. The F-16 didn't win by being faster or heavier, it won by staying inside the opponent's turn circle. And in air combat, that meant one thing the first shot, every time, inside Soviet command centers. The briefing slides were stark F-16 outmaneuvers, all known MiG designs, the reaction silence, then denial. But some commanders saw the truth that dogfighting had changed forever, and they were already too late, for decades. Soviet air combat doctrine had centered around a brutal truth: whoever fired first usually won, and to fire first, you needed speed, altitude, and radar range. That's why the Soviet Union had poured billions into fast interceptors like the MiG-25 long-range, radar-guided missiles like the R-40 and high-speed, ground-based command systems to vector fighters into firing position. But the arrival of the F-16 introduced a threat that didn't play by those rules. The American concept behind the F-16 was radically different. It wasn't about first-shot radar locks from dozens of miles away. It was about agility, rapid energy management, and close-in dominance. The F-16 was built around the idea that modern combat could quickly spiral into visual-range turning fights, and in that realm, the F-16 was untouchable. Soviet doctrine, and by contrast, was outdated. It emphasized ground control to guide fighters onto bombers. It assumed the primary threat was long-range American strategic aircraft, not highly maneuverable, multi-role jets like the F-16. Pilots were trained to fly in rigid formations, respond to radio commands, and fire missiles in narrow cones of engagement. But F-16s didn't stay inside those cones. They slipped under radar coverage. They pulled tighter turns than radar-guided missiles could follow, and they disrupted intercept patterns by forcing chaotic, fluid dogfights. Even more devastating, Western pilots were trained differently. U.S. Air Force and NATO fighter schools emphasized pilot initiative. Dogfight training in programs like Red Flag and the Fighter Weapons School, later Top Gun for the Navy, taught pilots how to fight in the chaos, not avoid it. Soviet pilots weren't just being outturned, they were being outthought. And as the F-16 spread through U.S., allies Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Turkey. Israel had introduced a new era of NATO air dominance. In Israel's hands, the F-16 became a battlefield scalpel, capable of precision strikes and dogfight supremacy. Back in Moscow, Soviet planners realized their aircraft were designed for wars that wouldn't happen and were poorly suited for the battles that would. The very nature of air power was shifting, and the Soviet response would come too late. It happened over the Baikal Valley in 1982. The Soviet MiG command wasn't there, but their aircraft were. Syrian pilots flew them. MiG-21s and MiG-23s veterans of countless confrontations had long been the teeth of Soviet-trained Arab air forces. They flew with confidence, armed with Soviet doctrine and radar-guided missiles, prepared to intercept and destroy the Israeli jets entering Lebanese airspace. But they weren't prepared for what came next. Dozens of Israeli F-16s, backed by F-15s and coordinated through airborne early warning, swept through Syrian defenses with terrifying speed. In the first minutes, MiG-21s vanished from radar. not shot down, evaporated. Syrian ground controllers couldn't keep up. Their intercept vectors were useless. By the time MiGs turned toward their targets, the F-16s were already behind them. Missiles launched, flames erupted. Then came the unthinkable Israeli F-16s, started turning inside MiG-23's aircraft designed specifically to outrun and outclimb NATO jets. In theory, the MiG-23 should have had the edge. It had speed, a variable sweep wing, a radar-guided missile suite. But the F-16 had something else, total energy maneuverability. American engineers had designed it to fight in a sustained 9G turn, to bleed speed slowly, and to recover it faster than anything the Soviets had. It was fly-by-wire, inherently unstable, controlled by a computer that turned chaos into control, and in close-quarters combat, that made it invincible. The Syrian MiG-23s couldn't turn tight enough. They overshot. They lost radar locks. F-16 simply pirouetted inside them, missiles off rails before the MiGs could even break away. In 1 week, Israel shot down more than 80 Syrian aircraft without a single loss. For Soviet engineers, watching this from Moscow was an intellectual nightmare. Their premier aircraft had been humiliated by a single-engine American jet once dismissed as too light to matter. But the most terrifying detail wasn't technological. It was psychological. The F-16 had flipped the balance of air power in the minds of Soviet-aligned air forces. Their best tools were no longer good enough. And that fear, more than any radar warning, was the real signal that the Cold War skies were changing. The footage was undeniable. Grainy infrared images from airborne Israeli cameras showed F-16s dancing through Syrian formations like sharks in a school of fish. Missiles hit home, parachutes opened, and wreckage burned in the sand. But in Moscow, disbelief reigned. Soviet Air Force generals, men who had trained entire blocks of Allied nations, who had written the dogfighting manuals used from Havana to Hanoi, refused to accept the data. Their first assumption was betrayal. Syrian pilots must have broken formation. Syrian controllers must have botched their vectoring. It couldn't be the aircraft. The MiG-23 was supposed to be a symbol of Soviet air superiority. It was fast, modern, powerful. If it was being defeated, something had gone wrong on the Arab side, and yet the numbers told a different story. Back-channel reports from advisors embedded with the Syrian Air Force painted a more grim picture. Pilots who had flown MiGs for years now reported being locked up and fired on from ranges they thought were safe. Their radar warning receivers screamed too late. Their missiles went blind, and in close-range combat, they simply couldn't shake the American jets. The F-16 wasn't just shooting, it was outthinking them. Inside Soviet design bureaus, engineers were tasked with forensic analysis. The variable geometry wings of the MiG-23, once hailed as revolutionary, now looked like a liability. Its radar suite, meant for interception, was no match for the electronic warfare systems built into American formations. Even worse, its weight and drag made it sluggish in turning battles the one domain where the F-16 reigned supreme. But what unsettled Soviet commanders most was how wrong their assumptions had been. They had believed, for years, that quantity and speed would win the skies, that pilots in MiGs, flying under strict vector control and doctrine, could overwhelm less disciplined Western jets. But the F-16 didn't play by those rules. It wasn't a tank in the sky, it was a knife. And it didn't just win fights. It exposed flaws doctrinal, operational, and psychological. Yet despite the mounting evidence, Moscow couldn't admit the truth. Doing so would mean rewriting the very logic of Soviet air strategy. It would mean questioning the value of millions of rubles spent on jets that now looked obsolete in the face of American agility. So instead, the Kremlin issued silence. No public condemnation of the MiG-23. No formal investigation into the Syrian disaster. Just quiet panic behind closed doors and a rush to modernize platforms that, until that moment, were believed to be invincible. The F-16 had forced a reckoning, and Moscow wasn't ready for what it revealed. In the wake of the F-16's stunning performance over Lebanon and Bekaa Valley, Soviet air strategists scrambled for a palatable explanation, one that would preserve the prestige of their aircraft and their doctrine. They couldn't acknowledge that a single-engine Western fighter had just humiliated their most advanced export jets. So they latched onto a theory. It wasn't the jet. They said it was the pilot. According to this theory, circulated in internal memos and classified briefings, the United States and its allies were winning air battles not because of better aircraft, but because of elite training, especially among Israeli and NATO pilots. It was claimed that these pilots had thousands of hours of flight time, regular dogfighting experience, and a deeply embedded culture of individual decision-making. Soviet pilots, by contrast, were trained in rigid formations, guided heavily by ground control, and conditioned to follow orders. Not improvise. Their training emphasized interception and speed, not turn fighting or initiative under pressure. The idea offered relief. If pilot training was the issue, not the platform, then the MiG-23 could still be redeemed. It just needed better operators. Soviet commanders found comfort in this because hardware was expensive to replace, but doctrine could be rewritten. So they doubled down on simulator time. They introduced new air combat maneuvering drills, and they issued orders to Syrian allies, tighten formations, improve GCI coordination, and reinforce radio discipline. But even as these adjustments were made, another reality kept intruding. In every encounter, even when the MiG-23 had a theoretical advantage speed, altitude, missile range it still lost. F-16s weren't just maneuverable. They were difficult to lock, hard to track, and lethal with their new generation sidewinders. Moreover, the American jets weren't acting like traditional Western aircraft. They weren't engaging at standoff range and retreating. They were diving into furballs, entering turning battles, fighting like their lives depended on it, and winning. And yet, Soviet High Command clung to the wrong theory. They ignored classified reports from Warsaw Pact exercises, where F-16 simulations consistently defeated MiG formations. They dismissed advisor testimonies from Middle Eastern clients who begged for help, modernizing outdated MiG tactics. And they refused to admit that a new era of fighter combat had begun, one where energy maneuverability, fly-by-wire responsiveness, and pilot-centric design mattered more than raw power. This doctrinal blindness delayed vital upgrades. It stalled the deployment of more agile successors like the MiG-29. And most critically, it left frontline Soviet-aligned pilots flying aircraft designed for a war that no longer existed. The F-16 wasn't just a tactical problem. It was a conceptual one. And the longer the Soviet command relied on the wrong theory, the more obsolete their air strategy became with every passing dogfight. With the pilot quality narrative losing traction, Soviet air theorists scrambled for another explanation, one that could reconcile the overwhelming losses without conceding technological inferiority. That second theory was electronic warfare. This time, the story ran like this. The F-16's success wasn't in its flight performance, but in its black boxes. NATO, the Soviets argued, had filled these fighters with jamming pods, radar deception systems, and advanced countermeasures that rendered Soviet missiles useless. The MiG-23 wasn't losing the dogfight, it was being blinded before it could even take aim. It was a theory that appealed to the Soviet mindset war as a battle of systems, not individuals. It allowed the Defense Ministry to redirect blame from aircraft designers or pilots and instead accuse the West of electromagnetic trickery. And in some cases, there was a kernel of truth. The AN/ALQ-131 jamming pods were extremely effective. Flares and chaff had grown more sophisticated. Western radar warning receivers could detect and respond to threats automatically. The F-16's digital systems, built into its modular avionics, could adapt mid-mission, a capability Soviet jets still lacked. But again, this theory missed the core issue. The F-16 didn't need to jam its way out of trouble. It simply flew circles around MiG-23s, bled them of energy, and picked them off with heat-seeking missiles. No jamming necessary. In fact, many of the kills in Lebanon and later skirmishes were achieved in visual range, with guns or heat-seekers scenarios where radar jamming made no difference. Soviet engineers were bewildered when sidewinders locked on even during high-G turns, when their own missiles had broken lock. The real problem wasn't the radar war, it was the energy maneuverability envelope. Still, the second wrong theory took root. It led to an overinvestment in electronic countermeasures ECCM across the Soviet arsenal. Missile seekers were retooled, radar filters were redesigned, signal discrimination algorithms were developed, all aimed at defeating phantom jammers that, in most cases, weren't even in use during the critical dogfights. Meanwhile, Soviet pilot training remained untouched. The MiG-23's clunky variable geometry wings, its slow turn rate, and poor rear visibility were not addressed. Commanders kept ordering their squadrons to fly head-on intercepts and vertical climbs, exactly the scenarios where F-16s excelled at slipping underneath, turning inside, and scoring kills. By clinging to the EW myth, Soviet doctrine missed the essence of the challenge. The F-16 was redefining what a lightweight, multi-role fighter could do. It wasn't just flying faster or jamming better, it was turning harder, reacting quicker, and letting the pilot become the weapon. The second wrong theory allowed Soviet planners to delay a reckoning. But each delay came at a cost paid in MiGs shot down, in export clients losing faith, and in pilots who knew, deep down, that their jets were flying into traps. The real war wasn't in the airwaves, it was in the turning circle. The magnitude of the disaster became fully apparent only when the Soviets began receiving post-mission reports from their client states in the Middle East. Dozens of dogfights, almost all ending the same way, F-16s winning within seconds, MiG-23s spiraling down in flames. Yet when KGB analysts reviewed the Air Force's pre-conflict assessments, they found no warnings, no red flags, just confidence. According to Soviet intelligence, the MiG-23 was supposed to be equal, if not superior, to anything NATO could field in the lightweight class. It had higher speed, long-range missiles, and powerful radar. Reports from Libya, Syria, and even Warsaw Pact exercises repeated the same phrase, qualitatively equivalent. That phrase became a punchline. The root of the failure lay in how Soviet intelligence collected data. Their view of the F-16 came through a distorted lens, public airshow demonstrations, grainy satellite images, and the occasional article from Western defense journals. No direct access, no adversary testing, no stolen technical manuals. The CIA had penetrated far deeper into Soviet development programs than the KGB ever managed in return. Worse, Soviet analysts were deeply compartmentalized. Signals intelligence rarely spoke to airframe experts. Radar analysts didn't consult with human factors specialists, and none of them were talking to the pilots on the front lines of Syria or Egypt, who'd already begun reporting disturbing kill patterns even before Lebanon erupted. The consequence was a strategic hallucination, the belief that technological parity still held. But parity had evaporated years earlier, while Soviet planners obsessed over top speed and radar range. The F-16's true edge was its fusion of systems, fly-by-wire controls, energy management, all-aspect missiles, and pilot-friendly cockpit layouts. These were not the kinds of improvements that showed up on spec sheets. They were battlefield advantages, and they were invisible to the Soviet mirror. The Israeli Air Force's results in the Bekaa Valley Air Campaign should have triggered a full-scale reassessment, but Moscow chalked up the losses to Zionist-American collaboration and blamed poor Arab training. The irony was bitter. They blamed their allies for not winning with Soviet jets against Western-designed fighters when those same fighters were doing exactly what they were built to do. By the time MiG-23s went up against F-16s over the Persian Gulf, the intelligence shortfall had become a crisis. UA's fighters were flying coordinated CAP missions, using AWACS cues, and downing targets before they were ever seen, in mock dogfights. Even training squadrons in NATO were beating MiG-equipped teams. No intelligence update was issued. Soviet planners continued allocating resources to missile range, not maneuverability. They kept producing MiG-23s even as export clients begged for replacements. North Korean, Syrian, and Cuban pilots filed grim after-action reports, many of which were buried or sanitized. The intelligence community had one job: to anticipate where and how the balance of power might shift. Instead, it assumed balance by default. The price was steep, measured not just in lost airframes, but in the erosion of trust within the Warsaw Pact, the demoralization of Allied pilots, and the sobering realization that America had spent the 1970s preparing for a new kind of war, while the Soviet Union had built faster relics. The F-16 was not a miracle of hardware. It was a miracle of doctrine, born from the ashes of Vietnam-era air combat. The F-16 was designed with one purpose: turn-and-kill superiority in the kind of dynamic, multi-band threat environments the Soviets still thought were decades away. It wasn't the fastest. It didn't carry the heaviest payload. But it was the first fighter built not just around an engine or a missile, but around a man. That was the essence of the American system. It started with the Boyd cycle, the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. This wasn't just a theoretical model. It was how American fighters were trained to think. Every engagement was a decision war. Whoever looped faster won. The F-16 was born from that thinking light, agile, fast to accelerate and faster to roll, with side-stick controls and relaxed stability for violent maneuvers at the edge of physics. Inside the cockpit, the pilot became the brainstem of a new doctrine. Instead of relying solely on centralized control, as Soviet systems demanded, American jets became decision-making nodes. The F-16's avionics suite allowed pilots to manage radar, weapons, and flight systems without taking eyes off the fight. Helmet-mounted cueing followed. Infrared search and track systems integrated next. Within a decade, the Yustuk pilot was no longer a passenger, he was a predator. But the F-16 was never meant to fight alone. Its lethality emerged from an ecosystem: the integration of AWACS, aerial refueling, real-time data links, and electronic warfare support. When an F-16 entered combat, it brought the entire American air architecture with it. Tankers gave it legs, satellites gave it eyes, and intelligence gave it forewarning. Soviet planners could never quite grasp this. Their worldview treated systems as discrete plane versus plane, missile versus missile. But the U.S. didn't deploy systems, it deployed strategies built on systems. In training, American pilots flew against aggressor squadrons, often using Soviet tactics. At red flag exercises in Nevada, F-16s practiced beyond visual range engagements under real radar jamming. They fought outnumbered over unfamiliar terrain, under pressure. They made mistakes, then debriefed every second of gun camera footage, radar track, and radio call, and they got better. Meanwhile, Warsaw Pact pilots flew carefully scripted drills. Mistakes were not learning opportunities, they were punishable offenses. Soviet doctrine demanded obedience, not innovation. This difference mattered. When the F-16 squared off against MiGs over the Middle East, it wasn't just a fighter versus fighter battle. It was doctrine versus doctrine. And American doctrine proved faster, looser, more lethal. In the 1982 Bekaa Valley Air War, Israeli F-16s downed Syrian MiGs by the dozen, often using coordinated strikes guided by AWACS and battlefield surveillance. The Syrians never saw their killers. In Iraq and later in Kosovo, the same story repeated, American F-16s showing up on no one's radar until missiles were already in the air. Yet the ultimate expression of the American system wasn't technical. It was cultural. Every component of the F-16 program was designed to make killing MiGs a repeatable, scalable, survivable process. From modular maintenance to interchangeable engines, to budget controls that kept costs low enough to deploy them in massive numbers. This wasn't just technology, it was bureaucracy weaponized, and then came exports, from South Korea to the Netherlands to Israel. America flooded the world with F-16s, and with each new operator came new upgrades, tactics, and feedback loops that made the entire fleet smarter. By 1990, the U.S. wasn't just flying the most maneuverable jet, it had created a global dogfighting brain. The Soviets had ace pilots, the Americans had networks. That was the true power behind the F-16's success. It wasn't the thrust-to-weight ratio, it wasn't the radar cross-section. It was that every part of its ecosystem training, support, strategy, intelligence was focused on one outcome, domination in the merge, superiority at every range, and survivability through every engagement. And for Soviet planners, still dreaming of one-on-one duels over Berlin, that was a nightmare they couldn't even detect until it hit them. It wasn't supposed to go like this. The MiG-29 Fulcrum had entered the stage with a roar Soviet engineers touting it as the ultimate counter to America's F-16. Agile, twin-engined, and armed with advanced missiles, the Fulcrum represented the cutting edge of Soviet air power. On paper, it was the F-16's worst nightmare. In Soviet simulations, MiG-29s dominated NATO airspace. Then came the Gulf War. For the first time, F-16s met MiG-29s in real combat. No red tape, no exercises, no referees, just pure air-to-air combat. And in that crucible, the truth was exposed. American F-16s wiped the sky clean over Iraq. F-16 pilots executed coordinated strike packages with SEAD support, AWACS coordination, and near-perfect situational awareness. When Iraqi MiG-29s rose to meet them, they died quickly and invisibly. Not one F-16 was lost to Iraqi fighters. Every Fulcrum that entered airspace occupied by U.S. Vipers was hunted and destroyed with stunning efficiency. And it wasn't even close. One infamous encounter became legend. A lone Iraqi MiG-29 pilot locked onto an F-16 from beyond visual range. Before he could launch, he was lit up by two AMRAAMs fired from a wingman he didn't know existed. The radar warning tone never came. He died before realizing he was being hunted. It was a surgical kill, precisely what the F-16 was built to do. But the real humiliation came not from missiles. It came from maneuvers. In multiple dogfights from Kosovo to Syria, to mock exercises after the Cold War ended, F-16s outturned MiG-29s in the merge. Pilots who had grown up worshiping the fulcrum's tight loops found themselves on the defensive. The F-16's fly-by-wire controls allowed it to hold angles the MiG-29's analog systems couldn't match. Its superior energy retention, even with a single engine, meant the F-16 could stay in the fight longer, faster, and more lethally. In a post-Cold War training exercise between NATO and former Warsaw Pact air forces, Polish pilots, once trained on the MiG-29, flew against American F-16s. They came in confident. They left humbled. Every engagement ended the same MiG-29s falling behind or losing sight entirely. It's like fighting a ghost, one pilot admitted. The F-16 is always where you aren't looking. But perhaps the deepest cut came in public. In air shows across Europe, the F-16 dominated aerobatic routines. While the MiG-29's famous tail slide wowed crowds, it was the F-16's tight loops, high G-turns, and seemingly physics-defying rolls that drew the biggest gasps. It didn't just beat the MiG-29 in combat, it outclassed it on stage. Back in Russia, the humiliation grew louder. Declassified footage from conflicts in the Middle East showed F-16s dropping precision munitions on targets that Soviet-trained crews had sworn were untouchable. MiG pilots who survived battles against F-16s were reassigned, debriefed, and often never returned to the cockpit. The myth of Soviet air superiority had been shattered not in theory, but in fire. Soviet propaganda machines tried to reframe the narrative, claiming poor training, outdated equipment, or political betrayal. But inside the command structures, the truth was undeniable. America had built a lightweight fighter that beat them at their own game. The F-16 wasn't supposed to dominate at every range. It wasn't supposed to survive direct hits. And it definitely wasn't supposed to do all that and still out-dogfight MiGs. But it did. And for a Soviet air command that had spent decades building its identity around air dominance, there was no deeper shame. Today, the F-16 Fighting Falcon stands not just as a success story, it stands as a symbol of how strategy, adaptability, and pilot-centric design can defy even the most intimidating adversaries. More than 4,600 F-16s have been built. It's flown by over 24 countries. It's participated in every major U.S. combat operation since the 1980s, from Operations Desert Storm to the War on Terror. Some air forces, like Israel's and Singapore's, consider it their primary warplane. But it's not just about numbers. It's about staying power. What makes the F-16 legendary is how it kept evolving. It was never locked in the past. It absorbed upgrades, advanced radars, new missile types, electronic warfare pods, and cockpit redesigns. Each evolution extended its dominance, not just keeping pace with new threats, but often staying a step ahead. And its reputation reshaped air combat training. The F-16 changed how NATO trained its pilots. No longer was brute speed or radar range the only priority. Dogfight maneuverability, energy management, situational awareness, and pilot survivability became pillars of air strategy. Even today's fifth-generation fighters, like the F-35, carry design philosophies inherited from the Viper simplicity, agility, and battlefield network integration. And for the Soviet Union, the F-16 was a wake-up call they couldn't answer in time. It exposed flaws in rigid doctrines. It embarrassed expensive designs like the MiG-29, and it helped accelerate the unraveling of a military mythology that had hidden behind numbers and projections. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet collapse didn't just happen economically, it happened in the air, where jets like the F-16 proved that Western technology and pilot skill could dominate. To this day, the F-16 still flies, and in every sharp turn, in every evasive roll, it carries a legacy of aerial supremacy that began with one simple truth: never underestimate a fighter built to fight. In a quiet hangar somewhere in Europe, an F-16 rests beneath decades of dust and honor. The paint has faded. The fuselage bears the wear of years spent on the edge of war zones, peacekeeping missions, and NATO exercises. But etched into its frame is a legacy that still echoes through the corridors of air power. To the west, the F-16 became the people's fighter, the plane that every American pilot wanted to fly, the symbol of agility and freedom in the sky. It never boasted the radar profile of a stealth jet, nor the raw speed of an interceptor. But it didn't need to. It won by maneuver, by cunning, and by the kind of instinct that turns dogfights into art. To the east, it was something more sinister. For Soviet commanders, the F-16 blurred the lines between technology and unpredictability. Their air defense systems struggled to track it at low altitude, their MiGs failed to outturn it, and their doctrine, so dependent on radar range, on missile saturation, on centralized control, broke apart every time a Viper entered the sky and bent the rules of engagement. Even after the Cold War ended, the lessons of the F-16 haunted military planners in Moscow. They poured billions into radar upgrades, digital command systems, and new airframes. But they could never quite recreate what the F-16 represented: a nimble, pilot-first design that was more than the sum of its parts. Today, as F-16s fly alongside stealth bombers and space-age drones, their silhouette is a reminder, not just of the Cold War's great standoff, but of the moment when the West stopped reacting and started dictating the terms of the air war. In every NATO exercise, in every training dogfight, where the Viper still turns tighter and climbs faster than its rivals, one truth remains undeniable. The ghosts of MiGs lost over the Fulda Gap still chase the F-16, but they'll never catch it.